On a frozen winter day in Luxembourg City, the 20th of December in 1944, General Omar Bradley clutched a telephone receiver so tightly his fingers ached. The connection crackled with static, but the voice on the other end came through with unmistakable clarity. It was Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander, and he was delivering news that would shake their friendship to its foundations. 2 entire American armies, the 1st and 9th, were being transferred to British control. Specifically, they were being placed under Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery. Bradley's composure, that steady Missouri calm that had served him through countless crises, shattered completely. His words came out in a rush of barely controlled rage. He told Eisenhower, his friend and superior, that he could not accept responsibility to the American people if this decision went forward. He would resign rather than accept this humiliation. Eisenhower's reply cut through Bradley's protest like a blade through fabric. The responsibility to the American people rested with him, not Bradley. Therefore, Bradley's threatened resignation carried no weight whatsoever. Bradley tried once more to object, then went silent, recognizing the futility of further argument. This conversation, happening while the German dictator's desperate Ardennes assault raged across the frozen forests, represented 3 years of accumulated American frustration crystallized into a single moment. Montgomery, the hero who had won at El Alamein and captured British hearts, had evolved into the single most divisive personality in the entire Allied command structure. The question American headquarters had been asking themselves from the deserts of Tunisia all the way to the approaches to Germany was straightforward yet damning. Why did an alliance formed to destroy Nazi totalitarianism find itself nearly torn apart not by the enemy they faced, but by the personality of one individual commander? The explanation couldn't be found in any single event or decision. Rather, it lay in an accumulation of moments, choices, and confrontations that began when Allied forces first landed in North Africa and continued through the muddy campaigns in northwestern Europe. What follows is an account of how extraordinary military talent became an extraordinary burden, how pride in one's nation collided head-on with the requirements of alliance warfare, and how American commanders developed feelings toward their most prominent British battlefield leader that ranged from deep frustration to something very close to hatred. The arithmetic of Allied command seemed simple enough on paper, though the political dimensions were far more complicated. By the latter months of 1944, American military forces in Europe substantially outnumbered British and Canadian troops. American factories were producing war materials at rates that dwarfed British industrial output, already strained by years of total war. Yet Montgomery appeared constitutionally unable to acknowledge these fundamental realities or modify his behavior in response to them. From the American perspective, Montgomery embodied everything their revolution had been fought to escape. There was an aristocratic presumption in his manner, a colonial condescension in his attitude, and an unshakable conviction that British methods and British leadership remained superior to all alternatives. Montgomery was no simple caricature, however. His brilliance was genuine, his meticulous preparation was legendary, and his careful husbanding of his soldiers' lives earned him deep loyalty from the troops he commanded. His victories were real achievements, his tactical understanding beyond question. British soldiers, who had endured devastating defeats in the war's early years, discovered in Montgomery a commander who delivered victories while keeping casualty lists manageable compared to the horrific losses of the previous war. Churchill treasured him as a military asset. The British public adored him as a national hero. None of these facts mattered particularly to American commanders who repeatedly found themselves marginalized, patronized, and publicly diminished by a field marshal who appeared to view them as enthusiastic but inexperienced amateurs requiring patient British guidance. The friction that developed had less to do with grand strategic disagreements than with something far more personal and corrosive. It was about respect, or rather the conspicuous absence of it. From their earliest encounters in North African campaigns through the final victory celebrations in Germany, American commanders discovered that Montgomery's treatment of them revealed deeply held assumptions about American military competence, American courage, and American worth that wounded more deeply than any battlefield setback. The 6th of March in 1943 found Lieutenant General George Patton stepping off an aircraft into the North African desert wind, which carried with it the acrid stench of burned vehicles and defeat. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. He had arrived to take command of the battered Second Corps some 20 days after German forces under Rommel had savaged American units in their first major encounter with experienced Wehrmacht troops. The defeat had been thorough, humiliating, and educational in the harshest possible way. What greeted Patton wasn't merely a demoralized command structure, but a British command hierarchy that had concluded American forces were unreliable and required close supervision. General Harold Alexander, the British commander now overseeing all Allied ground forces in Tunisia, had prepared an assessment of American combat performance that read more like a legal indictment than a military evaluation. American commanders lacked sufficient experience. American troops demonstrated inadequate discipline. American units needed extensive British oversight before they could be trusted with significant operational responsibilities. The report wasn't entirely unjustified. Kasserine Pass had exposed genuine deficiencies in American leadership, tactical execution, and coordination between different combat arms. However, Alexander's response went well beyond constructive criticism. His view was that Second Corps should be relegated to supporting missions while British forces executed the primary offensive operations. Patton grasped immediately what was truly at stake here. This wasn't simply about defeating Rommel's forces in Tunisia. It was about demonstrating that American arms could stand beside their British counterparts as equals rather than as junior partners requiring constant guidance. His diary entries from this period document his perception of British presumption and his determination to prove American worth through aggressive offensive action. Montgomery, commanding the British Eighth Army as it approached Tunisia from the eastern deserts, personified the British assumptions that so infuriated Patton. The victor of El Alamein carried himself with the confidence of a commander who had reversed Britain's fortunes in the Desert War. He had pursued Rommel across thousands of miles of North African wasteland through methodical, carefully orchestrated operations that emphasized overwhelming material superiority rather than tactical improvisation or risky maneuver. His soldiers trusted him because he won battles without squandering their lives unnecessarily. Yet his manner consistently suggested that he alone truly understood modern mechanized warfare, and that others, particularly the Americans, had much they needed to learn. Alexander's operational concept for the final Tunisia campaign reflected these underlying assumptions perfectly. Montgomery's Eighth Army would deliver the decisive blow against the Mareth Line, those Axis fortifications in southern Tunisia. Patton's Second Corps would conduct supporting attacks designed primarily to draw German attention and resources away from Montgomery's main effort. The Americans would function as Montgomery's shield, while the British won the glory of breaking through to Tunis and final victory in North Africa. The plan possessed military logic that was difficult to dispute. Montgomery commanded veteran troops with proven success against German armour. Patton led formations still learning their craft through hard experience. But the allocation of missions carried implications that extended far beyond tactical prudence. It established expectations and patterns that would haunt American commanders throughout the entire war. British forces would take the leading role, American forces would provide support, British commanders would receive the credit and recognition while American achievements went unnoticed or were minimized in official accounts. Patton launched his offensive toward El Guettar on the 17th of March in 1943, utterly determined to prove American competence through aggressive action. His orders reflected his personality perfectly, mixing tactical guidance with demands for aggressive forward leadership. Officers would lead from the front lines. American troops would demonstrate the same aggressive fighting spirit that had characterized their entry into the previous World War. Whatever the cost in casualties, Second Corps would demonstrate that it deserved treatment as a genuine combat force, rather than as occupation troops or security detachments. The Battle of El Guetar provided the vindication Patton sought. On the 23rd of March, 50 German tanks from the 10th Panzer Division emerged from mountain passes into the valley below, executing a dawn attack designed to shatter American defensive positions. What followed shocked the German commanders completely. American artillery, emplaced with meticulous attention to creating overlapping fields of fire, unleashed devastating concentrations on the advancing armour. Tank destroyer units, positioned to exploit every terrain advantage, engaged the panzers at ranges that negated German tactical superiorities. By the day's end, the battlefield was littered with destroyed German vehicles, and the 10th Panzer Division's attack had been stopped completely. For the first time in the war, American forces had defeated experienced German armoured units in sustained heavy combat. The victory should have been sweet, but it carried a bitter aftertaste that poisoned the achievement. Alexander's headquarters, focused intently on Montgomery's operations against the Mareth Line, paid minimal attention to Second Corps' success. British staff officers continued issuing detailed instructions to Patton, micromanaging American operations in ways that suggested persistent fundamental doubts about American competence. Even more galling, Alexander repeatedly changed Second Corps' objectives, shifting priorities in ways that appeared deliberately designed to ensure American forces remained auxiliary to British operations rather than pursuing independent objectives. Patton would receive orders to advance, then to halt, to attack with armour, then to lead with infantry instead. Each change disrupted American operations and signalled unmistakably that Second Corps existed primarily to facilitate Montgomery's plans rather than to achieve objectives of independent strategic value. When Montgomery finally attacked the Mareth Line on the 20th of March, his initial assault made minimal progress against determined German resistance. He adapted by shifting his main effort to an outflanking manoeuvre, demonstrating the operational flexibility that characterized his best work. But the modification required precious time, allowing German forces to establish new defensive positions further north. By the time 8th Army broke through, the opportunity for a truly decisive pursuit had evaporated. Second Corps continued its supporting attacks in central Tunisia, drawing German reserves away from Montgomery's front. American forces advanced steadily, taking their assigned objectives and inflicting significant casualties on Axis forces. Yet these achievements went largely unacknowledged in British official reporting and press accounts. Montgomery's breakthrough received extensive publicity and celebration. Patton's contribution, equally important to the overall campaign's success, merited barely a mention in most accounts. When the victory parade was finally held in Tunis on the 20th of May in 1943, with Eisenhower, Alexander and French General Giraud taking the salute, the narrative emphasized British and French achievements, while American contributions received only cursory acknowledgement. For American commanders, the Tunisia campaign provided lessons that extended far beyond tactics, logistics, and combined arms coordination. They learned that fighting alongside the British meant fighting simultaneously for recognition and respect, not just for military victory. They discovered that Montgomery, whatever his undeniable military talents, seemed genuinely incapable of treating American forces as true partners, rather than promising apprentices requiring patient guidance. They began to suspect that this attitude reflected not merely Montgomery's personal psychology, but a broader British unwillingness to accept that the balance of power within the alliance had shifted irreversibly toward Washington and American predominance. These lessons from North Africa would prove disturbingly prophetic when the Allies turned their attention northward to the next major objective. Sicily awaited, and with it new opportunities for friction and resentment. The 10th of July in 1943 found the largest amphibious assault in history, to that point rolling toward the shores of Sicily as Operation Husky commenced in darkness and heavy seas. Over 8 divisions, divided between Montgomery's British 8th Army and Patton's American 7th Army, stormed beaches from Cape Scaramia to Syracuse in an operation that would test Allied unity as thoroughly as it tested German and Italian defences. The operational plan for Husky had generated controversy from its very inception. Initial proposals envisioned landings dispersed across Sicily, seizing ports quickly to ensure adequate supply lines for subsequent operations inland. Montgomery detested the concept of dispersed landings with every fibre of his being. His experience in North Africa had convinced him absolutely that concentration of force was paramount, that scattering troops across multiple landing sites invited defeat in detail by concentrated enemy counterattacks. On the 24th of April in 1943, he articulated his objections forcefully and proposed an alternative concept. Concentrate all landings on Sicily's southeastern corner, giving 8th Army the unambiguous mission of driving straight north to Messina, the island's northeastern port and the gateway to mainland Italy. Air Marshal Tedder and Admiral Cunningham, responsible for air and naval operations respectively, opposed Montgomery's plan vigorously. It would leave 13 Axis airfields operational, posing unacceptable risks to the invasion fleet that would remain concentrated in confined waters. It would require ships to remain bunched together in limited sea room, vulnerable to sustained air attack for extended periods. Their objections carried considerable weight because both men commanded respect earned through successful previous operations. Montgomery's response revealed the full force of his formidable personality. He threatened, with Churchill's backing clearly implied, to resign his command rather than execute a plan he considered fundamentally flawed and likely to end in disaster. Faced with a crisis that threatened to derail the entire invasion, Eisenhower convened a conference for the 2nd of May to resolve this increasingly bitter dispute. The meeting exposed fault lines in the alliance that would only widen as the war progressed. Montgomery presented his case with confidence that bordered on arrogance, dismissing objections as though they were beneath serious consideration. Tedder and Cunningham pushed back vigorously, defending the critical importance of neutralizing airfields and ensuring naval security. Eisenhower, caught between military logic and political necessity, attempted to balance competing requirements against coalition politics. The compromise that emerged gave Montgomery much of what he demanded while attempting to preserve some operational flexibility. Landings would be concentrated in the southeast, as Montgomery insisted, but American forces would be given a more substantial role than Montgomery's initial concept envisioned. The plan still relegated 7th Army to supporting missions while British forces pursued the primary objective of reaching Messina first. But at least American forces wouldn't be merely guarding supply lines while Montgomery's army won the campaign. Once again, American forces found themselves assigned secondary missions, while a British commander pursued glory and decisive victory. The decision rankled for reasons that transcended Patton's considerable personal ego. By July of 1943, American forces in the Mediterranean theatre had grown substantially in size and capability. 7th Army comprised 3 infantry divisions, 1 armoured division, and substantial support troops, a force comparable in overall size to 8th Army. American industrial output was flooding Allied stockpiles with equipment of all types. American air power dominated Mediterranean skies increasingly. Yet the command structure continued treating American forces as auxiliaries to be employed at British discretion rather than as equal partners in a common enterprise. Patton's diary entry from the 12th of July captured his frustration with brutal clarity. Alexander and his entirely British staff had visited 7th Army headquarters to present the final operational plan, a plan that in Patton's view cut Americans completely out of any possibility of reaching Messina first and claiming that symbolic victory. He noted with bitter resentment that Alexander, supposedly commanding both British and American armies impartially, arrived with not a single American officer on his staff. "What fools we are," Patton wrote, recognizing that American political leaders had accepted a command arrangement that virtually guaranteed American marginalization regardless of battlefield performance. The landings themselves went reasonably well, despite chaotic airborne operations that saw British and American paratroopers scattered across the countryside, with many drowning when their gliders crashed into the Mediterranean. By dawn on the 10th of July, both armies had secured their assigned beachheads and were pushing inland against variable resistance. Initial opposition from Italian coastal divisions crumbled quickly under Allied pressure. German counterattacks against Gela Beach, where Patton's forces landed, were defeated with crucial assistance from naval gunfire and determined fighting by the 1st Infantry Division. Montgomery, confident that Axis resistance would collapse before methodical British pressure, signalled Alexander that the route to Messina lay open before his 8th Army. His forces would drive straight up the eastern coast highway. Patton's 7th Army would protect 8th Army's flank and rear areas, while Montgomery pursued what he confidently assumed would be a demoralised and retreating enemy. The signal revealed Montgomery's operating assumptions with perfect clarity. British forces would deliver the knockout blow that won the campaign. American forces would provide security and support. Victory would belong to Montgomery and 8th Army. Reality intruded on these assumptions with uncomfortable swiftness. German forces, far from collapsing as Montgomery anticipated, established strong defensive positions, exploiting Sicily's mountainous terrain to maximum advantage. 8th Army's coastal advance ran directly into brutal resistance south of Mount Etna, where German paratroopers held positions that channeled British attacks into carefully prepared killing zones. Montgomery's methodical approach, so devastatingly effective in the open desert terrain of North Africa, struggled against defenders who could concentrate forces on narrow frontages and fight from prepared positions with excellent fields of fire. On the 12th of July, as 8th Army's advance stalled frustratingly, Montgomery sent a signal to Alexander that would come to define Anglo-American relations for the remainder of the war and beyond. He proposed that 8th Army expand its operational area westward, effectively commandeering a key highway that had been explicitly assigned to 7th Army in the original plan. The expanded frontage would allow him to outflank the German positions blocking his direct advance up the coast. American forces should halt their operations and assume defensive positions, while 8th Army executed the offensive maneuver that would cut Sicily in half and secure final victory. The signal's tone was every bit as significant as its actual content. Montgomery didn't request Alexander's approval for this substantial modification to the agreed operational plan. He informed Alexander of his intentions and suggested that American forces should adjust their operations accordingly to accommodate British requirements. The presumption was absolutely staggering in its implications. Montgomery was proposing to appropriate operational areas explicitly assigned to American forces, relegate those same American forces to static defensive missions, and execute a strategy that would ensure British forces alone gained credit for Sicily's conquest. Alexander, whose admiration for Montgomery clearly outweighed whatever confidence he possessed in American commanders, agreed to Montgomery's proposal with barely a moment's hesitation. On the 13th of July, he issued an order assigning Montgomery control of the disputed highway and instructing Patton to halt offensive operations and defend while 8th Army advanced. For American commanders reading this order, the message was utterly unmistakable. British preferences would determine Allied strategy regardless of American contributions, capabilities, or legitimate interests. Patton's initial response demonstrated perfectly the political constraints that frustrated American commanders throughout the entire war. Despite his absolute fury, expressed in diary entries comparing Montgomery to an insufferable prima donna and Alexander to an incompetent sycophant, Patton formally accepted the order without any official protest. He understood with perfect clarity that Eisenhower, commanding Allied forces in the Mediterranean, could not afford open revolt by subordinate commanders regardless of how justified their grievances might be. Coalition warfare required compromise and accommodation, even when that compromise meant swallowing entirely justified anger and resentment. However, Patton had absolutely no intention of allowing 7th Army to sit passively idle while Montgomery pursued victory and glory. If Alexander would not assign Americans a primary mission of real strategic significance, Patton would create one through his own initiative. He flew directly to Alexander's headquarters on the 17th of July, carrying detailed maps and a fully developed proposal. Rather than defending passively as ordered, 7th Army would drive northwest toward Palermo, Sicily's capital and principal port. The operation would cut the island in half, trap substantial Italian forces in western Sicily, and secure port facilities that would dramatically ease American supply difficulties. Alexander, perhaps genuinely surprised by Patton's aggressive initiative, or perhaps simply relieved to see American energies directed away from Montgomery's operations, gave his approval. This decision fundamentally altered the entire Sicily campaign in ways Alexander probably didn't fully anticipate. Rather than a single British advance up the east coast supported by American defensive operations, the Allies would now conduct two entirely separate major drives. Montgomery would continue pushing toward Messina from the south and east. Patton would race to Palermo, then pivot east and drive toward Messina along Sicily's northern coast. What began as a strategic adjustment rapidly evolved into an intensely personal competition between two proud commanders. Patton, absolutely determined to prove American capabilities beyond any possible doubt and reach Messina before Montgomery could, drove his command with characteristic relentless intensity. 7th Army moved with a speed that shocked both allies and enemies, covering rugged mountainous terrain at rates Montgomery's methodical approach could never hope to match. Just 12 days after the initial landings, American troops entered Palermo on the 22nd of July, capturing Sicily's largest city and a major strategic port facility. Montgomery, meanwhile, continued his grinding advance against German defences south of Mount Etna. His progress remained measured, professional, and increasingly irrelevant to the campaign's ultimate outcome. German forces, recognizing clearly that Sicily could not be held indefinitely against Allied material superiority, had already begun preparing elaborate plans for evacuation across the Strait of Messina to mainland Italy. The real question was no longer whether the Allies would conquer Sicily, but rather which Allied army would reach Messina first and claim the symbolic victory that would dominate headlines and historical accounts. The race to Messina revealed character and capability in equal measure. Patton pushed 7th Army to the absolute limits of human endurance, demanding relentless forward movement regardless of obstacles or mounting casualties. His corps commanders, thoroughly accustomed to his driving style, pushed their divisions mercilessly hard. American engineers repaired damaged roads and blown bridges with remarkable speed and efficiency. American infantry marched through oppressive heat and punishing mountainous terrain at paces that left supply units struggling desperately to maintain contact and keep pace. Montgomery's 8th Army, facing admittedly stronger opposition on more difficult terrain, advanced with characteristic methodical care. British commanders, trained through bitter experience to minimize casualties and carefully husband finite resources, refused to risk tactical disasters in pursuit of operational speed. The contrast illustrated fundamental differences in American and British military cultures that extended far beyond individual personality. Americans, with vast manpower reserves and seemingly unlimited industrial capacity, could afford to accept tactical risks and absorb heavy casualties in pursuit of operational objectives. The British, fighting continuously since 1939 with steadily dwindling manpower pools and an exhausted economy, simply could not afford such profligacy. Yet the race was also intensely personal between Montgomery and Patton. Montgomery's public statements and private correspondence revealed unmistakably that he considered 8th Army's mission more important and more militarily significant than anything 7th Army was accomplishing. American success in reaching Palermo swiftly, from Montgomery's clearly stated perspective, demonstrated nothing of genuine military significance. Patton had faced weak Italian opposition in secondary terrain of limited strategic importance. 8th Army confronted veteran German troops in strong defensive positions that heavily favoured the defender. The comparison, Montgomery implied repeatedly, was entirely meaningless. American commanders interpreted Montgomery's dismissive assessment of their achievements as absolutely characteristic British condescension. They had heard remarkably similar evaluations throughout the Tunisia campaign. American successes were consistently minimized or explained away. American difficulties were attributed to inexperience and inadequate training. American commanders were patronized as enthusiastic but fundamentally untutored amateurs. This persistent attitude suggested unmistakably that British respect for American military arms was purely conditional at best, extended grudgingly only when American forces operated under direct British command guidance and explicitly for British strategic objectives. On the 17th of August in 1943, elements of Patton's 3rd Infantry Division entered Messina several hours before British forces arrived in the city. 7th Army had unquestionably won the race. Yet the victory proved hollow in ways that reflected the increasingly toxic state of Allied command relationships. Montgomery's public reaction artfully combined superficial graciousness with subtle but unmistakable dismissal of American achievement. He congratulated Patton formally, while simultaneously emphasizing the far greater difficulties 8th Army had faced, and implying clearly that terrain and enemy disposition rather than relative competence explained different outcomes. British press coverage faithfully reflected Montgomery's careful framing of events. Reports celebrated 8th Army's hard fighting against the Germans, while consistently treating 7th Army's rapid advance as an interesting sideshow against inferior opposition in less important terrain. American achievements were duly acknowledged but systematically diminished in importance, presented as complementary to rather than genuinely equal with British operations. For American commanders reading these accounts with mounting frustration, the message could not have been clearer. British narratives would invariably centre British achievements regardless of objective evidence to the contrary. The Sicily campaign left deep scars in the alliance that would never completely heal. American commanders had demonstrated conclusively that their forces could match British troops in operational tempo, tactical flexibility, and raw combat effectiveness. Yet recognition from their British counterparts remained grudging, conditional, and hedged with qualifications. Montgomery, in particular, seemed genuinely constitutionally unable to acknowledge that American commanders might possess military skills genuinely comparable to his own, or that American forces might deserve credit truly commensurate with their substantial contributions to Allied victory. Two specific incidents during the Sicily campaign further poisoned already deteriorating relationships. On the 3rd of August and again on the 10th, Patton physically slapped hospitalized soldiers he accused of cowardice, triggering a massive scandal that would haunt his career permanently. When word of these incidents reached Montgomery, his response was coldly dismissive in ways that revealed his deeper assumptions. Patton's behaviour, Montgomery suggested to colleagues, merely confirmed British assumptions about American indiscipline and excessive emotionalism. A proper British commander, Montgomery implied with aristocratic superiority, would never lose control in such undignified fashion. The second telling incident involved a young British lieutenant Montgomery dispatched to Patton's headquarters as a liaison officer. The lieutenant arrived with a single suitcase tied shut with ordinary string, a shabby appearance that absolutely enraged Patton. Earlier, Patton had sent Montgomery a complete liaison team, including a full colonel, a major, and sophisticated communications equipment. In exchange, Montgomery had casually dispatched a single junior officer with completely inadequate equipment and support. Patton immediately sent the lieutenant back with a tersely worded note explaining that he could not permit boys to operate in his headquarters during active combat operations. The incident was admittedly minor, even slightly comical in its pettiness, yet it captured perfectly the casual fundamental disrespect that consistently characterized Montgomery's treatment of American counterparts. Patton commanded an army equal in size and capability to Montgomery's 8th Army. He deserved by any reasonable standard of professional military courtesy liaison officers of appropriate rank, experience, and competence. Montgomery's conspicuous failure to provide them suggested unmistakably that he viewed 7th Army as fundamentally subordinate regardless of official command relationships or formal organizational charts. As Allied planners turned their collective attention to the invasion of Italy proper, and eventually to Operation Overlord, the massive cross-channel invasion of France, one critical fact had become utterly indisputable. Bernard Montgomery viewed himself as the preeminent Allied battlefield commander in Europe, and he expected appropriate deference from supposed American subordinates accordingly. That American commanders increasingly viewed Montgomery himself as the primary obstacle to genuine Anglo-American partnership appeared not to register with the British Field Marshal at all. Or perhaps more disturbingly, it registered but simply didn't matter to someone so supremely confident in his own military judgment. The 1st of September in 1944 found Allied armies sweeping across northern France in pursuit of shattered German forces. The breakout from Normandy had utterly destroyed German defensive positions in France, sending Wehrmacht units reeling eastward in what appeared to be headlong panicked retreat. Paris had been joyously liberated on the 25th of August amid scenes of celebration that seemed to confirm the war's imminent victorious conclusion. From the Normandy beaches all the way to the Belgian border, Allied armies pursued defeated enemies across terrain where just months earlier German forces had seemed utterly unbeatable. Final victory, perhaps achieved before Christmas, appeared tantalizingly within reach. For Field Marshal Montgomery, recently promoted and thoroughly basking in the reflected glory of Normandy's success, this moment demanded characteristically bold, decisive action. He had commanded all Allied ground forces throughout the Normandy invasion, a responsibility that, combined with his earlier celebrated victories in North Africa and Sicily, confirmed his status in British eyes as the nation's greatest living battlefield commander. Now, with German armies in apparent complete disarray, Montgomery perceived a golden opportunity to end the war with a single climactic decisive thrust deep into Germany. Yet September 1st also brought a command change that Montgomery resented with barely concealed fury and frustration. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, formally assumed personal direct command of all Allied ground forces throughout the theatre. Montgomery, who had exercised operational control of both American and British armies throughout the Normandy campaign, was now relegated to commanding only the 21st Army Group, comprising British and Canadian forces fighting in northwest Europe. His American counterpart, Omar Bradley, commanded 12th Army Group, consisting of the American 1st, 3rd and 9th Armies. The change was absolutely inevitable given political and military realities. American forces in Europe now outnumbered British and Canadian troops by increasingly substantial margins. American logistics sustained all Allied operations across the theatre. American air power dominated European skies completely. American industrial capacity provided the fundamental material foundation enabling Allied victory. Political reality demanded unequivocally that Americans command a coalition that had become overwhelmingly American in composition and supply. Montgomery intellectually understood the politics driving this decision, but he accepted neither its military necessity nor its operational implications. In his firmly held view, dispersing command authority among multiple independent headquarters fatally diluted the decisive, concentrated leadership that final victory absolutely required. Eisenhower, whatever his undeniable political skills and diplomatic talents, fundamentally lacked the battlefield experience necessary to direct ground operations effectively. The Supreme Commander's proper role, Montgomery argued with increasing public stridency, should be strictly limited to political coordination and logistical management. Operational command of all ground forces should remain concentrated in the hands of a single experienced ground forces commander, meaning someone with Montgomery's extensively proven battlefield credentials and tactical acumen. The proposal had one glaringly obvious primary beneficiary, namely Montgomery himself. Yet the Field Marshal consistently presented his case as military necessity rather than naked personal ambition. Eisenhower's planned strategy, advancing into Germany on a broad front with multiple armies attacking simultaneously across a wide frontage, was in Montgomery's firmly stated view strategically catastrophic. It dispersed finite resources, prevented decisive operational concentration, and absolutely guaranteed that the war would drag on well into 1945, rather than ending quickly. Montgomery's preferred alternative was characteristically bold and characteristically self-centered in its conception. Rather than a broad front advance that he dismissed as inherently indecisive, the Allies should concentrate overwhelming forces for a single powerful thrust into northern Germany. This thrust would cross the Rhine River, seize the vital Ruhr industrial region, and drive all the way to Berlin before German forces could possibly establish coherent new defensive lines. Montgomery would naturally and inevitably command this decisive operation personally, with American forces relegated to providing support and protecting exposed flanks. The proposal's actual military merits were highly debatable among professional military analysts. A narrow, concentrated thrust deep into Germany would create an extremely elongated salient dangerously vulnerable to enemy counterattacks from both flanks. It would require essentially abandoning offensive operations everywhere else along the front, allowing German forces to concentrate overwhelming strength against the single advance. It depended entirely on capturing bridges intact over multiple major rivers and maintaining precarious supply lines over hundreds of miles of contested enemy territory. Most fundamentally, it assumed optimistically that German resistance had collapsed so completely that a rapid mechanized advance would face only minimal scattered opposition rather than determined coordinated defense. Yet the proposal's political implications were utterly unmistakable to every American commander who examined it. Montgomery was explicitly asking American political leaders to subordinate their increasingly predominant armies to British command for an operation specifically designed to ensure that British forces, under unquestionable British leadership, would deliver the final decisive blow ending the European war. He was effectively requesting that American troops serve primarily as Montgomery's protective shield, while the British Field Marshal personally achieved ultimate victory and claimed eternal historical glory. He was demanding in practical effect that Eisenhower voluntarily surrender operational control to a subordinate commander who made absolutely no secret of his profound contempt for the Supreme Commander's strategic judgment and military capabilities. Eisenhower, constantly attempting to balance genuine military necessities against delicate coalition politics, characteristically sought compromise. He would not concentrate all available forces for Montgomery's northern thrust as demanded. However, he would grant Montgomery operational priority for supplies and equipment and authorize a substantial limited operation to seize critical bridges across the Rhine in the Netherlands. Operation Market Garden, as this plan was formally designated, would employ 3 elite airborne divisions to capture intact bridges at Eindhoven, Nijmegen and Arnhem. British ground forces would then advance rapidly north across the captured bridges, establish a secure bridgehead over the Rhine, and position themselves favourably for subsequent offensive operations driving deep into Germany. For American commanders, particularly Bradley and the ever-aggressive Patton, Montgomery's latest grandiose scheme confirmed absolutely their very worst suspicions about British intentions. The Field Marshal was once again transparently attempting to relegate American forces to supporting roles while British troops exclusively pursued glory. He was demanding supplies and equipment that might otherwise sustain ongoing American advances through central France toward Germany. He was proposing a militarily risky operation whose potential gains seemed wildly disproportionate to the substantial risks involved. Patton, whose Third Army was driving hard toward the German border through eastern France, absolutely exploded with rage when he learned that precious fuel allocations were being systematically redirected to support Montgomery's operation. His army had demonstrated conclusively throughout August that aggressive American operations could advance faster and penetrate deeper than cautious British movements ever would. Third Army was rapidly approaching both the German border and the Rhine River itself. Yet Eisenhower was effectively halting successful American operations to resource a British field marshal whose consistent track record suggested methodical extreme caution rather than genuine operational boldness. Bradley, normally far more diplomatic in temperament than the volcanic Patton, nevertheless shared his subordinates' deep frustration with this situation. Montgomery consistently requested additional resources, threatened dire consequences if his demands were denied, and received operational priority regardless of legitimate American needs or impressive American battlefield achievements. The fundamental politics of coalition warfare, Bradley recognized with weary resignation, guaranteed that British demands would invariably receive sympathetic hearings at the highest political levels, even as American forces increasingly provided the overwhelming bulk of Allied combat power and suffered the majority of casualties. On the 17th of September in 1944, Operation Market Garden commenced with the single largest airborne operation in military history. Over 35,000 American and British paratroopers dropped from transport aircraft or arrived in gliders across Dutch agricultural fields, tasked with rapidly seizing multiple bridges before German forces could destroy them. British ground forces spearheaded by XXX Corps began advancing north along a single narrow highway, desperately racing to relieve isolated airborne units before inevitable German counterattacks could overwhelm their positions. The operation failed comprehensively and catastrophically. Allied intelligence had detected substantial German armoured units positioned near Arnhem, the operation's northernmost and most critical objective, but these urgent warnings were inexplicably dismissed by planning staffs. Airborne forces landed much too far from their assigned objectives, allowing Germans precious time to organise effective defences. The single narrow highway rapidly became a death trap, with British armour completely unable to advance quickly or manoeuvre effectively off roads bordered by impassable marshland. German resistance, far from collapsing as optimistically predicted, actually intensified dramatically as Wehrmacht commanders recognised the serious threat and rushed substantial reinforcements to the threatened sector. At Arnhem Bridge, British paratroopers under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost held one end against absolutely overwhelming odds for several desperate days, constantly expecting relief forces that never arrived. XXX Corps, repeatedly stalled by determined German counterattacks and utterly unable to bypass destroyed bridges blocking their advance, never came anywhere close to reaching Arnhem. By the 25th of September, when the operation was finally abandoned as hopeless, over 17,000 Allied troops had been killed, wounded, or captured in what amounted to a complete disaster. The butcher's bill included roughly 6,400 paratroopers who had landed at Arnhem, most now dead or prisoners of war. The failure was absolutely total in every meaningful sense. The Rhine remained uncrossed. German defences in the Netherlands solidified rather than collapsed. Allied momentum, which throughout early September had seemed utterly unstoppable, dissipated completely in Dutch fields and along a highway that would be remembered as a death trap. The precious opportunity to potentially end the war in 1944 evaporated in what would ultimately prove Montgomery's single most catastrophic mistake of the entire war. American reactions combined vindication with profound anger. Patton and Bradley had vigorously opposed Market Garden from the beginning, arguing forcefully that its substantial risks dramatically outweighed potential benefits. They had explicitly suggested that resources allocated to Montgomery's scheme would be far better employed continuing successful American advances toward Germany. Their professional objections had been summarily dismissed, overruled by political necessities and Montgomery's characteristically insistent certainty. Now, with Market Garden's failure utterly undeniable, American commanders felt entirely entitled to considerable satisfaction that subsequent events had completely confirmed their professional military judgment. Yet satisfaction was absolutely overwhelmed by fury at Montgomery's response to this disaster. Rather than accepting personal responsibility for an operation he had personally conceived, planned, and commanded, Montgomery characteristically claimed Market Garden had been 90% successful. The bridges at Eindhoven and Nijmegen had been captured as planned. Allied forces had liberated substantial Dutch territory. That Arnhem, the operation's entire purpose and primary objective, had not been secured was presented as merely a minor unfortunate setback in an otherwise triumphant campaign. The claim was breathtaking in its fundamental dishonesty. Market Garden's entire strategic purpose was establishing a bridgehead over the Rhine River. This critical objective had not been achieved. The operation had cost over 17,000 casualties for absolutely no strategic gain whatsoever. Yet Montgomery was publicly declaring victory, brazenly rewriting obvious failure as success through sheer force of personality and manipulative public relations. American commanders recognized this maneuver for exactly what it represented, namely Montgomery protecting his cherished reputation at the direct cost of truth. When Montgomery succeeded, credit belonged exclusively to him alone. When operations faltered, elaborate explanations invariably involved inadequate resources, insufficient support, or failures by others. Personal responsibility for setbacks remained conspicuously absent from Montgomery's carefully constructed narrative. Yet Montgomery's most egregious offense against American goodwill was still to come. In the immediate aftermath of Market Garden, as Allied operations necessarily transitioned to grinding attritional advances against significantly strengthened German defences, Montgomery began publicly and repeatedly criticizing Eisenhower's fundamental strategy. The broad front approach, he argued openly in comments to British press and in signals to Churchill, had tragically squandered the golden opportunity for truly decisive victory. Had his original plan been fully adopted, had he received all the resources and complete authority he had requested, the war would already be over and won. This critique conveniently ignored multiple inconvenient realities. Montgomery had received very substantial resources specifically for Market Garden. The operation's catastrophic failure resulted primarily from fundamentally flawed planning, serious intelligence mistakes, and dangerous underestimation of German defensive capabilities rather than from inadequate logistical support. Yet Montgomery's self-serving narrative skillfully transformed obvious operational incompetence into a supposedly missed opportunity caused primarily by others' strategic short-sightedness. For American commanders forced to read these accounts, Montgomery's deflection confirmed absolutely that the field marshal would never acknowledge personal error under any circumstances. Every setback inevitably became someone else's failure. Every success remained his personal triumph. This consistent pattern suggested not merely vanity or ego, but something far more corrosive, a fundamental incapacity for honest, realistic self-assessment that made Montgomery genuinely dangerous to Allied unity, even as his undeniable tactical skills remained militarily valuable. The 16th of December in 1944 brought catastrophe. At dawn, German forces launched their last desperate great offensive in the West, attacking through the Ardennes forest in a huge gamble to split Allied armies and somehow seize the vital port of Antwerp. The massive assault achieved complete tactical surprise, smashing violently into thinly held American positions and creating a dangerous bulge in Allied defensive lines that would give this battle its enduring name. For 10 desperate days, the ultimate outcome hung precariously in balance as German spearheads drove relentlessly toward the Meuse River, threatening to fracture Allied defences completely and prolong the war indefinitely into 1945. The Battle of the Bulge became simultaneously Montgomery's finest hour and his worst moment. His actual military performance was genuinely exemplary. When Eisenhower transferred temporary command of American 1st and 9th Armies to Montgomery on the 20th of December, the Field Marshal immediately imposed much-needed order on initially confused defensive operations. He positioned British reserves to defend critical Meuse River crossings. He effectively coordinated American counterattacks. He demonstrated under genuinely desperate crisis conditions exactly why Britain valued his military leadership so highly. Yet Montgomery's public conduct after the battle sowed deep bitterness that would persist for decades after the war ended. On the 7th of January in 1945, With German forces in full retreat and Allied victory now assured, Montgomery held a press conference ostensibly to praise American troops and defend Eisenhower from criticism. What emerged instead was a masterclass in self-promotion cunningly disguised as gracious compliment. Montgomery began by praising American soldiers' fighting qualities in combat. However, he very quickly pivoted to describing his own supposedly decisive actions upon assuming command, actions presented as crucial interventions that had saved American forces from impending disaster. As soon as I saw what was happening, Montgomery explained to assembled reporters, I took certain immediate steps myself to ensure that if the Germans somehow reached the Meuse, they would certainly not get across that river. He continued at length, describing how he had tidied up the battlefield, how he had thought strategically ahead, how he had ensured proper balanced dispositions. The battle, Montgomery concluded with evident satisfaction, had been most interesting, quite possibly one of the most interesting and tricky battles he had ever personally handled throughout his long distinguished career. Throughout this entire self-congratulatory recitation, British actions were prominently highlighted. Montgomery's supposedly brilliant leadership constantly emphasized, and American commanders rendered conspicuously absent from the entire narrative. The performance was calculated insult cunningly disguised as gracious compliment. Montgomery praised American soldiers while simultaneously implying they had been saved primarily by his superior leadership. He credited American courage while directly suggesting that American commanders had been completely overwhelmed by rapidly developing events until British professionalism imposed necessary order. He characterized a desperate defensive battle, won primarily by American units like the legendary 101st Airborne at Bastogne and by Patton's brilliant rapid counterattack from the south, as fundamentally a Montgomery triumph and vindication. American reaction was absolutely explosive. Bradley, reading press reports of the conference, felt profound personal betrayal. Montgomery had commanded 2 American armies for barely 3 weeks. Those armies had fought magnificently, holding stubbornly against overwhelming odds until German offensive momentum finally exhausted itself. Patton's Third Army had executed a tactically brilliant counterattack, pivoting 90 degrees in terrible winter conditions to relieve surrounded Bastogne. American soldiers had paid in blood to defeat the German dictator's final desperate gamble. Yet Montgomery's carefully crafted narrative systematically minimized American contributions while elevating his own role to central decisive importance. This wasn't merely personal vanity or ego. It was historical theft, a calculated attempt to rewrite American victory as British rescue. More disturbingly, American commanders recognized this as Montgomery's absolutely authentic view of events. He genuinely believed that his personal intervention had saved American forces from disaster. He saw absolutely nothing inappropriate in claiming primary credit for a battle won overwhelmingly by troops he had commanded for less than 1 month. The press conference triggered something very close to a complete command crisis. Bradley called Eisenhower furious far beyond any diplomatic constraint. He could not, he declared flatly, continue to serve under Montgomery's command. If Eisenhower seriously intended to give the British Field Marshal permanent command of American forces, Bradley would immediately resign his command. The ultimatum was not an idle threat made in momentary anger. Bradley, normally the most diplomatically skilled of all American commanders, had finally reached his absolute breaking point. Eisenhower, recognizing that Allied unity now hung by the thinnest possible thread, attempted to calm Bradley while privately drafting a stern message to the combined chiefs of staff. In it, he stated plainly that he would formally request Montgomery's relief from command unless the Field Marshal apologized promptly and ceased his public criticisms of American leadership. The war had been won militarily, Eisenhower implied, but whether the alliance itself would survive final victory remained genuinely uncertain. The crisis was resolved only after intense British political pressure forced Montgomery to recognize his serious error. On the 12th of January, Montgomery wrote formally to Eisenhower expressing regret and acknowledging that his press conference had caused unintended offense. To Bradley, he sent a conciliatory letter praising American troops and expressing gratitude for the honor of temporarily commanding them. The letters were gracious, apparently sincere, and largely irrelevant to American commanders. The damage was done completely. American commanders now understood with absolute crystal clarity that Montgomery would never view them as genuine equal partners. Every operation would be filtered through Montgomery's assessment of how it affected his personal reputation. Every failure would be explained by insufficient support or errors by others. Every success would be claimed as validation of Montgomery's superior wisdom. This pattern was fixed, entirely predictable, and ultimately intolerable. Yet more than mere personality clashes were at stake here. By early 1945, the balance of forces in Europe had shifted so decisively toward American predominance that Montgomery's pretensions to battlefield supremacy had become not merely personally irritating, but genuinely operationally counterproductive. American armies numbered in the millions. American logistics sustained every Allied operation. American industrial output dwarfed all other contributors combined. American air power dominated European skies completely. Yet Montgomery stubbornly continued behaving as though British wisdom must necessarily guide American strength. The fundamental contradiction reflected broader tensions in Anglo-American relations. Britain, utterly exhausted by 5 years of total war and facing post-war economic collapse, struggled painfully to accept that its global predominance had ended permanently. The United States, rapidly emerging as the world's dominant power, was discovering that military might created political responsibilities that American isolationist traditions had not prepared the nation to assume. Montgomery's persistent inability to adjust to these new realities made him a perfect symbol of Britain's difficulty accepting diminished status in the post-war world order. Churchill, watching Montgomery's press conference disaster unfold with alarm, recognised the serious danger to the alliance. He spoke carefully in Parliament on the 18th of January, deliberately calibrating his words to repair damaged Allied relationships. The Battle of the Bulge, Churchill stated clearly and unambiguously, was predominantly an American battle, an American victory, and would be remembered throughout history as an ever-famous American triumph. British forces had played an important but ultimately supporting role, exactly as coalition partners should in such circumstances. The speech was diplomatic necessity, correcting Montgomery's self-serving narrative and acknowledging military realities that could no longer be denied. Yet it also represented Britain's painful acceptance that the war's remaining campaigns would be primarily American endeavours fought with American resources. British forces would participate, contribute meaningfully, and share in ultimate victory. However, American commanders would increasingly dictate strategy, direct operations, and rightfully claim the credit that their forces' overwhelming predominance clearly merited. Montgomery, increasingly isolated by his own conduct and growing ever more irrelevant to operations dominated by massive American armies, spent the war's final months commanding 21st Army Group in Northern Europe. His operations remained professionally competent, his tactical sense still sound. Yet his relationship with American commanders never recovered from the accumulated damage. Bradley avoided him whenever possible. Patton despised him with barely concealed contempt. Eisenhower tolerated him as political necessity demanded, but never again trusted either his judgment or his motives. The 8th of May in 1945 brought German unconditional surrender. The European war was won. Victory belonged to an Allied coalition that had overcome not merely Nazi Germany, but also dangerous internal divisions that had repeatedly threatened to tear it apart from within. In the immediate euphoria of peace, old bitter conflicts were temporarily submerged beneath celebration. Montgomery received accolades from a grateful British public who knew him as a national hero. American commanders returned home to massive celebrations that properly recognized their extraordinary achievements. However, in memoirs and histories written long after the war ended, the deep conflicts resurfaced with surprising intensity. Montgomery's published recollections, appearing in 1958, reignited old bitter controversies by criticizing Eisenhower and implicitly claiming that Montgomery's strategic vision had been fundamentally superior all along. Eisenhower, then serving as President of the United States, broke off all personal contact with Montgomery, refusing to correspond with a former colleague who seemed pathologically determined to refight battles from a vanished war. Bradley's detailed memoir, published in 1951, meticulously documented numerous instances where Montgomery's conduct had seriously undermined Allied operations and damaged coalition unity. Patton's posthumously published diary revealed the full depth of his profound contempt for the British Field Marshal. American histories of the war, drawing extensively on these accounts and official records, presented Montgomery as undeniably talented but impossibly difficult, genuinely brilliant but absolutely insufferable, a commander whose real military contributions could not be denied, but whose toxic personality made him a serious liability to coalition warfare. British historians vigorously defended Montgomery, arguing that American commanders never properly appreciated his methodical approach, his genuine concern for minimizing casualties, or his strategic sophistication. They noted repeatedly that Montgomery never lost a single major battle after assuming command in North Africa. They emphasized that his meticulous planning and preparation had made D-Day's success possible. They suggested that American criticisms primarily reflected jealousy of British professionalism and resentment of superior British military traditions. The historical debate continued for decades after all participants' deaths. Historians argued endlessly about Montgomery's true contributions, about whether American frustrations were justified, about how personalities affected military operations and strategic decisions. Some concluded that Montgomery was a genuinely great commander who was simply poorly suited to the demands of coalition warfare. Others suggested that American commanders, lacking Montgomery's extensive experience, naturally resented his superior professional judgment. Still others argued that the conflicts reflected inevitable tensions when proud nations attempt to cooperate under desperate pressure in existential struggle. Beneath all historiographical debates lay a simpler fundamental truth, one that American commanders of the Second World War understood with crystalline clarity. Bernard Montgomery, for all his undeniable talents and real achievements, fundamentally could not treat American forces as genuine equals, deserving of respect. Whether this deep incapacity reflected personal arrogance, ingrained cultural prejudice, or British national determination to maintain fading global supremacy remained eternally debatable. What was utterly indisputable was that Montgomery's consistent conduct poisoned Allied relationships and created completely unnecessary obstacles to effective coalition warfare. The American experience with Montgomery provided painful lessons that outlived the war by decades. Future coalition operations would be deliberately structured to prevent personality conflicts from undermining military effectiveness. Command arrangements would be carefully designed to ensure proportional representation and prevent any single nation from dominating simply through superior confidence or dubious claims to historical precedent. American military culture would internalize permanent wariness of allies who confused genuine partnership with comfortable subordination. For the Americans who fought alongside Montgomery from Tunisian deserts to German mud, the Field Marshal represented everything they believed their ancestors had rejected in 1776. The deeply embedded assumption that British wisdom must inevitably guide American strength, that colonial enthusiasm required metropolitan sophistication to achieve success, that New World energy needed Old World experience to avoid disaster. They discovered through bitter experience that battlefield excellence, massive industrial might, and consistent military success could not overcome cultural assumptions rooted in centuries of British global dominance and imperial superiority. Montgomery never understood this fundamental reality. Until his death in 1976, He maintained stubbornly that his wartime conduct had been entirely appropriate, his frequent criticisms completely justified, his strategic vision genuinely superior to alternatives proposed. He remained utterly convinced that Eisenhower's leadership had been inadequate, that American commanders had conspicuously lacked his professional competence, that the war could have ended significantly sooner had his advice been followed consistently. American commanders who survived Montgomery offered markedly different verdicts. They acknowledged freely his tactical skills and operational competence, but questioned seriously his strategic judgment and coalition management. They praised his characteristically careful preparation, but noted repeatedly that wars are won by calculated boldness as well as methodical caution. They conceded his genuine concern for minimizing casualties, but observed that Montgomery's excessive caution sometimes allowed dangerous enemies to escape complete destruction. They concluded, with near-perfect unanimity, that Montgomery's difficult personality made coalition warfare far more difficult than militarily necessary. The final assessment belonged properly to Eisenhower, writing reflectively years after the war ended. He acknowledged Montgomery's considerable military abilities without reservation, but noted pointedly the field marshal's complete inability to understand the essential political dimensions of coalition command. Montgomery, Eisenhower concluded with devastating precision, was a man whose undeniable military talents could not be questioned, but whose profound lack of diplomatic sensitivity made him fundamentally unsuited for senior command in Allied coalition operations. It was perhaps the most devastating possible critique. Not that Montgomery lacked military competence or tactical skill, but that his genuine virtues were overwhelmed completely by serious character flaws that undermined the very cause he served. In coalition warfare, where personality affects operational effectiveness as profoundly as tactics or strategy, Montgomery's fundamental incapacity for treating allies as genuine equal partners made him not merely personally difficult to work with, but actively dangerous to alliance unity. The Americans learned this painful lesson through accumulated bitter experience, from North African sand through Italian mountains to German mud. They discovered that military alliances require far more than shared enemies or common strategic objectives. They demand mutual respect, genuine acknowledgement of partners' contributions, and consistent willingness to subordinate personal ego to collective purpose. Montgomery, whatever his other considerable qualities, simply could not meet these basic requirements. In that consistent failure lay the answer to why the Americans developed such negative feelings toward Montgomery. Not because he was British, not because he favoured methodical operations, but because he made them feel like colonial auxiliaries in a war they were actually winning, soldiers whose blood mattered but whose professional judgment did not, allies valued only insofar as they facilitated British glory and Montgomery's personal reputation. That bitter memory outlasted Montgomery himself, outlasted the entire generation that served with him, outlasted even the Cold War alliance that grew directly from wartime cooperation. It served as a permanent reminder that technical excellence alone cannot substitute for basic human respect. That battlefield brilliance means very little if it alienates those whose cooperation victory absolutely requires. Bernard Montgomery was many things simultaneously. Brilliant tactician, methodical, careful commander, authentic British hero. Yet to the Americans who fought alongside him from Africa to Germany, he was also a cautionary tale about the severe limits of military genius divorced completely from diplomatic wisdom and coalition management. The question was never whether Americans recognized Montgomery's genuine talents. They absolutely did. The real question was whether Montgomery could recognize and respect theirs. He could not. In that fundamental failure of imagination and respect lay the deep roots of a bitterness that no amount of shared military victory could ever erase.